life. Fiona Patten, so lovely to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks for inviting me.
An absolute pleasure. I am a big fan of your work. I really appreciate how much effort and energy you've invested over the last few years in helping build out the cannabis framework in Victoria/Australia, because it's had a net effect. And I'm really excited to understand from your perspective how you see adult use cannabis evolving in initially Victoria, and I'd love to speak about the work you're doing, and then at a broader sense how it might evolve across Australia. If we use Victoria as the benchmark, as the kind of starting grounds, if you will, for medical, there could be a domino effect based on a lot of the work that you're doing today. So I'd love to dive into the details of what you're working on.
Sure. Yes. Well, you're absolutely right. And I think adult use cannabis, the legalisation of it is inevitable in Australia. And we've already seen some, I suppose, baby steps in that regards, that we've seen largely a decriminalised system in South Australia, West Australia, and certainly now what the ACT would like to call a legal system, which is a grow your own without penalty scheme, but it's a very limited scheme. In Victoria, we have established a parliamentary inquiry into cannabis use. Now, the way politics works and the way you get these types of things up is you have to kind of go back and forth and negotiate with the government to get the numbers to allow it. So when I said I'd like to legalise cannabis and I'd like an inquiry to look into it, they just went, as much as we might agree with you, there is no way that we're going to agree to a committee about legalising cannabis, which is so, and that's fine, because the starting point where I wanted to start was the same place that Canada started. And their question when they were looking at cannabis legalisation was, how do we keep cannabis out of the hands of criminals and children? Now, in Victoria, and I think the numbers would be similar nationally, around 26% of people under the age of 25 have smoked cannabis in the last 12 months, compared to 11% have smoked tobacco. So, wow. Yeah, prohibition isn't working. Education, regulation, taxation is working. And that's why we're seeing such low rates in smoking amongst young people. So now we start this process of doing the inquiry. And that, that's to kind of give the government I suppose the evidence that this is what the community wants, that this is the right path. We've only just opened it up for submissions, and certainly COVID interferes with a few of these things, but we've opened it up for submissions. I believe we've received like 1,300 submissions already. I'll ask Adam to put a link to the.
Please, yeah, I want to share that with everyone, and put it in the mail out as well. Definitely.
Yeah, great. So the committee's website, we've kind of done this thing where we're asking a series of questions as well. So when people come onto the site, we can ask them a series of questions. So it gives us a really good snapshot of what people are thinking, and we're seeing, we all know that the community has changed on cannabis. Medicinal cannabis has helped, but I'm hoping that this committee, which has got people from the Labor Party, the Liberal Party, the Justice Party, myself, so there's a whole so it's a real multi-party committee. I'd hoped to take them overseas, as I did with another committee a couple of years ago, but that won't be possible. But I hope to remotely take them to the retail outlets of Colorado, or the growing centres and the social enterprises of Canada or Uruguay, or we've just seen Chicago legalise. So yeah, I'm hoping to take them on a virtual tour. And I'm hoping at the end of this, we can show that there's a pathway for Australia, but for Victoria to go it alone, as we did with medicinal cannabis, and hopefully that would lead to a change nationally.
Yeah, there's so many questions I have that arise from what you just shared there, because I see this as such a fascinating endeavor. You've got so many moving parts here. The fact that the Canadians, the country of Uruguay, Luxembourg, Mexico is now looking at legalization. There's all of these countries that are now falling into place. I mean, New Zealand being the closest relative to us, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But it's very interesting timing during COVID. I think it presents an issue from the ability to proceed forward, but the opportunity that might come of this. Like, one of the things that I've pondered to myself and had discussions around with friends is, what does the benefit of an economical framework that allows for cannabis at an adult use level how does that promote an economy during a time where we're about to see a collapse?
That's right.
What about the implications of adult use cannabis in this particular instance?
We have, and we're really trying to look at the economics of it and where we can find those economics. So we've done some really modest costings around the money that would be saved, and possibly, you know, it's hard to kind of work out a taxation or licensing to fall on a number, but you know, we've conservatively said that it would bring at least $70 million to the Victorian coffers through savings and through licensing fees. But that doesn't even begin to consider the employment opportunities, the business opportunities of this, the manufacturing and cultivation opportunities for this. So that's what I hope that this inquiry will help tease out. And you know, we probably have a fairly good idea about how many people consume cannabis, but working out those price points, and also working out how you can get a system. And this is what Canada, California, Colorado, Luxembourg, Mexico will all grapple with, is how do you find a product that you don't over-regulate so that the black market is more attractive. The police said once that this industry was worth like $10 billion in Victoria alone.
Wow. When was that? Do you know when that was reported?
It was reported in The Age, and I just found the article. I found the article like a week ago and sent it to someone. So again, I'll give it to you to share.
I'd love to look at that, because especially from the police's aspect, I mean, imagine the reduction in crime and the shift of resources from the police that are now currently, you know, focused on cannabis convictions. That's also another major driving force to clean up the streets, to make Australia safer. It seems like a no-brainer. It's interesting that it hasn't been implemented yet, but it's also quite clear why it hasn't been implemented yet, because it's taboo, it's uncharted territory, and there's only been a handful of countries that have really put their hat in the ring, so to speak. So I guess kind of looking at the other countries like Canada and Uruguay, I'm sure you've studied these countries. What have you learned from these different recreational/adult use markets that you intend to bring to Australia, to Victoria?
It's been really interesting looking at the different models, and you know, I instigated a drug law reform inquiry a couple of years ago, and that committee travelled. So we travelled to Portugal, Switzerland, US and Canada. And the US kind of laissez-faire, anything goes kind of model won't work for Australia. So it's finding that middle ground. I think Canada, because they pose the question about how do we regulate this existing industry. We know this industry exists. We know that criminals are running it. We know that no one is checking ID before selling cannabis or any other drugs. So if we want to address this as a health issue, if we want to address it as a justice issue, then legalisation provides us with a pathway to do that. I think from an Australian perspective, talking about doing it from a state has its issues, and it's so looking at Canada, we see that because Canada is a federated country similar to Australia. They have different rules to us, but states in Australia do not have the ability to allocate it to allocate a tax or a levy. That all has to be done at a federal level under our constitution. So what I have learned is probably the best model will be a national model, but I can't see that happening for a long time. So we're in Australia, in Victoria, we will probably have to look at what a hybrid model might look like. Now, I don't want to second guess what the committee comes out with, and what we're going to hear about this. So there might be some really clever ideas from a whole range of people on how that might work. But you can't say that cannabis is completely harmless. So you have to take it from that health and safety approach. And so that does mean providing some restrictions. And I think that is something that most people would live with. The police tell me that they now, because they could bust a hot house any day. They reckon there's 1,000 hot houses in Greater Melbourne growing cannabis any night of the week, and they could bust them. But frankly, they don't have the storage space to put all the hydroponic stuff, and they haven't worked out a way of disposing safely with all the cannabis that they seize, and they catch the international student that's turning the lights on and off, or making sure the plants are being watered. They're not capturing the big guys. I'm hearing our Victorian cannabis is actually finding its way into remote areas of Northern Territory. So there's a really big we have a really big distribution model coming out of Victoria as well. I think Canada is a good place to look for us.
With we'll broach on other countries in a moment. I just want to take a step back around the comment that you made towards cannabis not having its harms, like alcohol, which is completely regulated.
Yeah.
And I like to think of this analogy that during the 1920s to 1930s, the Al Capone era, you've got an example of how the prohibition period not only failed, but it created a wave of crime that is still noted in the history books today. But you fast forward almost 100 years and you don't see liquor stores having turf wars or having any type of kind of price fixing distribution schemes, harm, selling to children. None of that exists because it's completely regulated. So it begs the question: why are these examples used as references to kind of appeal to the conservative thinker?
It's a good question, and it's both ways. So people will say to you, look at the damage that alcohol has caused our society. Why would you want to introduce another psychoactive substance onto the marketplace? But on the other side, you say, look at the damage that prohibition does. Why wouldn't you want to regulate it, control it, and educate people about the possible harms and risks of this product? So I think the latter argument is more compelling. And I think the idea of why would you want criminals growing this product? Why would you want young people interacting with criminal organizations to purchase cannabis? Why wouldn't you want to control it? Why wouldn't you want to put it into a retail model or a regulated model where you can ensure that, as we've talked about before, Adam, but ensure that safe growing techniques are used. So
Mm.
we're not seeing dangerous pesticides or dangerous products being used in fertilizers and things like that.
Mm. Mm. And also the potency piece. I mean, that's
Yeah.
the increase of THC potency over the last decades is quite well documented. Having the regulated market would allow for the kind of normalization of these products in a way that it's safe
Yeah.
for adults to use.
Yeah.
And that 11% statistic that you mentioned about tobacco, that's a really compelling number right there. Because ultimately, children, I know of so many people that have shared their story of, cannabis, and a lot of it starts at a very early age. It's quite surprising how young. I'd love to see the stats on the number of teenagers using cannabis in Australia, because I'm sure it's quite a large number. Do you have any number around this?
When I say 26%, that's kind of a breakdown of the under 25. So you'd say that there's a lot of teenagers. There's a lot of teenagers in that, in those figures, and that's been the interesting thing that we've seen in jurisdictions like Colorado and Oregon and Washington State, that have all had a legal system for quite some time. They have not seen an increase in youth cannabis, the use of cannabis amongst young people. In fact, depending on the report that you read, but a number of them would say that there's actually been a reduction, and that's probably due to a couple of things. One, that their parents are using it, so it's not cool, but two would also be that it's slightly more difficult to obtain now, because there's very little black market.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. In Portugal, when decriminalisation was introduced, one of the stats that was quite clear was the reduction in teen use of narcotics. So you could assume that the same numbers would carry on.
Yeah.
Because it's harder to gain access, and people have licenses that they could lose thousands of dollars for. There's huge incentives to not be caught selling these products.
That's exactly right. And we know, and I think it's probably moving slightly sideways, but we know that this product, we know from a medicinal cannabis area, which is where we sort of met each other, Adam, but in that area, we know that the vast majority of people who use cannabis for medicinal purposes buy it illegally. They can't afford the prescriptions. Their doctors won't prescribe it for them, so they resort to that green market. Now, and this has been the conversation in New Zealand as well, that if we legalise cannabis, then people will be able to grow it. They will be able to grow a strain that works for them. They will be able to juice it and just use that raw plant that probably has just some incredible nutrients that we're still just beginning to discover. And then on the other side, you mentioned the strength of THC. When you go into a Canadian store, personally, I'm not a big fan of really high THC products. I like a much more balanced product. So, but if you go into a store in Canada, you can select that, where depending on where you get your product in Australia, you don't know what you're going to get. You don't know what strain they've grown, and what the strength and what the THC CBD percentages are. So
you have no. I mean, you have to use some pretty interesting analytical testing tools to ascertain what those certificates of, we call it certificate of analysis, but what the chemical makeup would be. You're not going to find a black market grower that finds that to you. And there's so much risk inherent to that, because ultimately there might be. I mean, I spoke to Debbie Mary about this quite some time ago, around how there are different cannabis strains that actually not only don't work for people, that could cause harm. Now, that's not going to be a majority; it will be a minority, but there's still a chance for harm. The transparency is an absolute essential. And I think the get there is through regulated products. But you just mentioned New Zealand, and I really admire what New Zealand has done in the medical space. They've allowed now for discretionary prescribing of THC and CBD products for all doctors around the country. Those products meet strict quality standards. We're talking GMP certified facilities, validated machines that have been overseen by a regulatory body, consistent products, consistency, stability data, and shelf life, etc. So it's a very complex process, which means that only a select number of businesses will be able to export there, which is good because it means that doctors can go to sleep at night knowing that they've prescribed a product that is 100% quality.
What it says on the packet.
Yeah. And I think that's essential to learn recreational market. But in New Zealand, and I want to stay on New Zealand for a bit, they're now looking at a recreational model. I'm sure you've spent some time looking at that. Can you give us an overview of what that looks like?
Yeah, so it's and I think they've been really smart on this. So they've put out an exposure draft of the bill. They've worked through that, and they've put out drafts of the bill. They have a final of the bill, and they're saying this is what we will be legislating. Not, will we legislate cannabis and everyone to go, what if? So this is how we will legislate it. It will only be sold from licensed premises. Those premises won't be able to sell alcohol. There will be, I believe they're going to restrict to stop clustering of lots and lots of stores selling together. They're allowing you to grow at home, but in a very restricted way. And probably, I think in looking at it, it's probably not perfect, but it's a really good first step, and it's really something that everyone should get behind. And if anyone knows a New Zealander living in Australia who hasn't enrolled to vote, get them to do it. They can do it online. New Zealanders can vote in this referendum, which will be at their next election, which has been postponed till October. But it's a licensing system. It's a taxation system. The taxation is being earmarked for health and education. They've also got a component that looks at the Maori community and how social enterprises amongst the Maori community can be assisted through the legislative process. So it's about, they know that, the cannabis prohibition has affected the Maori community more than it has affected most other, the white community of New Zealand as far as incarceration, etc. So they are looking at models to really lift up the Maori communities and sort of be proactive in providing them with licensing. So it's a really beautiful product that I think they're staying away from edibles initially, but that is framed in the sense that they believe that they will bring edibles on at a later date. And we saw exactly the same thing in Canada.
Yeah, indeed.
So it's a similar model. There obviously there will be really strict requirements on testing and on cultivation within that. But it's a very straightforward model. It doesn't look dissimilar to how they regulate and legislate alcohol. It's probably a bit stricter. They've set the minimum age though at 20, rather than 18. And again, I think I've been saying this a lot today actually, but try not to let the perfect get in the way of the good. So 20 they think is that finds the right balance in not being criticised for giving it to people still when their brains are still growing.
Yep.
And then
I'd say 25. I'd say 25. That's really when the brain stops fully forming. But I'd be a little bit more strict. But I can appreciate that there's got to be a middle ground. I
think also when you look at where the numbers of people who do consume cannabis, how their age, if you knock out the 20 to 25s, you've probably knocked out a quarter of the market. So, and it's not about knocking out a quarter of the market, but you've left a quarter of the market still relying on the black market.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you could limit THC exposure for those lower strength products, kind of like your learners, your probation, and your full driver's license. That's a way they could get around it.
That is an interesting model, and you know, in America, you see that in some jurisdictions, like you can buy beer at 17, but you can't buy, you know, whiskey till you're 21. They have those different sort of models. So that's an interesting idea, and something that, you know, maybe Australia or Victoria could consider as well. They've also put a limit on THC. So I don't. Some people have commented about it's an arbitrary maximum, but I think for an adult use recreational product, I don't think it's a bad thing. You know, certainly if you were using it for pain, or if you were using it as a medicine, that might be a different thing. And I think certainly the medicinal products you might see some high, you'll see some high THC products in the medicinal market.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point there, because I've thought on a number of occasions when people ask me if I'm in support of adult use, I'll always say yes, but let's get medical right first, because you don't want to have your patients migrating to the adult use market because the products are, you know, stronger or price point, etc. So you need to make sure that medical is price accessible, but you'd also want to make sure that things like THC content can be accessed at a higher level for a medical market to ensure you keep patients with that medical market, because people will go where the price is competitive and they'll get the highest you know, per milligram price point based on, you know, what they're trying to treat. So that would be my concern, but it's a good way to get around it.
Yeah.
The other point I thought I'd raise, and when people say about, I'm quite in favor of home growing, because you look at the alcohol industry, who makes their own alcohol at home? Like a very small portion of passionate drinkers will make their own beer. Same is going to be the case with cannabis. There's not everyone's going to grow their own cannabis. It's just not a place for it for everyone. No. So I think that you get those enthusiasts that come on board and grow their own. So long as there's restrictions like they've done it. I mean, I don't know much about ACT. I believe you can't trade your cannabis or take it off site.
Yeah, I'm from the ACT, so I think that I'm quite critical of the model that they introduced this year. Back in the 90s, when we actually decriminalised cannabis in the ACT, the rule was you could grow up to 5 plants, and it was a $50 fine if you were, you know, if the police wanted to fine you for being in possession of up to about 50 grams. Now I think you can grow 2 plants, and you can't grow them inside. You can't grow them on the balcony. You can only grow them out of sight in a garden. So that knocks out every single person who lives in an apartment building, and it knocks out every single person that doesn't have a backyard. So and it's 1 or 2 plants rather than the original 5, and it puts them in breach. It puts them in direct contradiction with the federal legislation, which in the ACT, because they're not a state, means that they're at risk of the feds just overturning the law. If they just left it decriminalised, the feds couldn't touch them.
Yeah, that's a bit strange. I'm not sure. Not sure why they made that decision. I don't know enough about it to really comment with any authority, but it was interesting nonetheless to see the publicity that came from it. Also the backlash from the federal government, very much not in favor of this change. They haven't done anything about it, but it still was very clear. And that's also the type of behavior that doesn't necessarily support it keeps the narrative going, but I do think that what you're doing with this inquiry is the right way to approach it. How long have you been working on it for? And when do you suspect that you'll be able to submit and the inquiry will begin?
Yeah, so it was one of the goal objectives when I was re-elected in 2018, that I would take the work that we had done in the drug law reform inquiry, which was a really substantial inquiry, and and focus that and further work on it with cannabis, to the point of trying to get recommendations to legalise it legalise and regulate it in Victoria. So I put the motion to the House in 2019, but and I happen to be chair of the committee that's undertaking this inquiry. So I put the motion to my own committee, and we've been doing a big homelessness inquiry. So I haven't been rushing it, and I don't think there's any need to rush this. And in some ways, and I've been quite open about this, that we need to get our homelessness inquiry right, and I want to do the right things on this. But I also think it would be really great if New Zealand had already had already had their referendum, had already considered it. Hopefully that referendum supports the legalisation, but had done that, and that we were in that environment where our nearest neighbour has just legalised cannabis, and that we were seeing Mexico, France, Luxembourg, all of those other jurisdictions and other American states legalise, that there was just this growing swell towards legalisation, that we embarked on this inquiry at that time. So yeah, it's starting in full. We've been amazed by the number of people who have put submissions in, but yeah, I reckon we'll report probably around July next year.
July next year, okay.
Yeah.
And what happens after the inquiry is submitted? What do you see as the next kind of dominoes to fall?
Yeah. Well, it depends a bit on where the inquiry lands and what recommendations it makes. We've considered, and this is completely separate from the inquiry, but we've thought about a referendum here as well. Like, could Victoria have a referendum on this? And we've got legal advice to say we probably could. And this was something we were looking at during the election in 2018. So that would be one option. But certainly, maybe depending on what recommendations the inquiry found, maybe the next step would actually be putting a bill up. And this is something I've been passionate about for a very long time. So it's so that what that legislation would look like has been something that has been on my mind for a lot of years, and there's far greater minds than I that have also worked on that. But yeah, I'd like to see Victoria hopefully move to a legalisation model. I think we've kind of won the war on a decriminalisation model. If we said, and no one should ever be criminally charged for possessing or growing a personal amount of cannabis, I don't think I'd get too much argument. But once you put it into a commercial concept, that's when it gets more complicated. But that's when I think it becomes much more effective in, as I started with, keeping criminals out and keeping it away from children.
Yeah, I think that's a really correct line of thinking that could be applied to this. I mean, I support decriminalisation. It would make a lot of sense to implement a proper framework. There are two frameworks that come to mind initially. You've got Netherlands with the coffee shop models, and then you've got Canada, which is more. There aren't establishments where people can consume cannabis freely, from my understanding. I could be wrong. But which of those models, or the hybrid of both, what do you consider about Australia implementing its own model? Based on your understanding of like political sentiment, how do you think Australia would implement? What would they do? Would it fall in line with one of those two? Would it be a mixture of both? What do you see?
That's right. And and you can throw into that the model. Well, you can throw into that something like Uruguay, which is a largely a government owned and operated enterprise. So they grow they grow it, they sell it, they tax it. And you know, there's been some diversification in that model in Uruguay over the last little while, but so you could look at a government model where the government was the owner of the plantations. The government might, you know, might license that, you know, license that to other people to grow for them, or you know, you might look at a model. You could look at a model like that. Look, again, I'm really cautious not to preempt the inquiry, but you know, these are all the things that go through my head when I'm thinking about these. So you could do that. You could look at a system, and Canada has different systems. So the Alberta system's different to the Ontario system. Some of them allow consumption. Others are very concerned about smoke-free places. And I remember I met with the Ontario Health Department as they were grappling with where cannabis smoke sat within their smoke-free regulations. And they looked at, and they were saying, Fiona, for example, in a lot of our apartment buildings, they are completely smoke-free. So you can't smoke in those apartment buildings. So you have to go downstairs to smoke your cigarettes. They said, but is that what we want with cannabis? Do we want people
clustering outside, smoking their cannabis? Yeah,
smoking cannabis. Probably not. And then they argue that the other point on that is that the way we use cannabis is very different to the way we use the way we use tobacco. It's less common. You know, we're not. Generally speaking, we're not chain smoking cannabis. Often it's part of a social setting. So I think they fell on the grounds that they would actually exempt cannabis smoking from the smoke-free rules in residential buildings. But these are all the questions that make it fascinating.
Yeah, I find it so interesting because the challenges that I've seen come out of Canada would be the distribution system's quite complex. You've got the licensed producers that will grow a particular amount of cannabis that's bought by the state, then it's redistributed by the state to the distribution outlets, which there are only a small number. And as a result, the Canadian numbers, unfortunately, aren't that impressive. It's consistent growth, but not what was initially predicted by the licensed producers. This is why you're seeing a number of facilities shut down, a number of companies let go of employees, because the demand has not been. It's not that there isn't a demand, it's just that the ability to access has been restricted and the price points are high, and the material that's being consumed often, from what I hear, is not as consistent and as quality driven as the black market, which is peculiar. But they've got a lot of tourism that comes in to kind of lift up that make kind of bridge that gap. But then you look at somewhere like Colorado, which the adult use sales have grown consistently month on month, and I believe they collected $203 million in tax revenue as of July from the previous tax year. I mean, that's just Colorado State. So the state of Colorado. So I think this model needs to be deeply considered, because there are two parallels where you can see one state is benefiting significantly from a very American style model, very kind of carefree, so to speak. I don't say that it's carefree, but there's a lot less restriction. And then the Canadian model, which is highly restrictive, and the sales are just it's growing, but it's not growing to the capacity which they was initially expecting.
Yeah.
So yeah, I wonder where Australia will land in that respect, because I do believe it will come. I'm guessing 5 years. What's your, if you're a betting woman, what would you bet?
Yeah, I'd like to, obviously I've got a plan that we legalise it before the next election in Victoria, so 2022. Again,
okay.
But that's my own little personal ambition. However, I think just going back to your point on Canada, and that's the other interesting thing. Like in Canada, each state took a different approach. So, and some states like Ottawa, which is one of the largest states, provinces, Ontario, they, I think I'm right, it's either Ontario or Toronto. The government owns the liquor store, the alcohol stores.
Yes.
The government owns the distribution, but in BC, British Columbia, they don't. So it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So yeah, so in some of the jurisdictions in Canada, it's the government controls the wholesale distribution as well as the retail sale of it. In other jurisdictions, as I say, like in Vancouver, that's not the case. It's a different model. So it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And I think those are the things that this inquiry should look at, is what does that look like? Like, what's Chicago, what's Illinois going to look like when it legalizes? Because it will be the last state. So it will have looked at the growing problems that Colorado, Oregon, Washington, California, all of the other states have had. I think New Mexico's on, but yeah. And
Nevada's definitely
Nevada's on. That's right.
Yep.
That's right. And then then you look at models like Washington DC, which has a sort of a Spanish club decriminalization hybrid sort of model. That
the social clubs, interesting. I don't know enough about the social club. So they've got a social club model in DC.
It's not quite a social club, but you can share. So you can grow for others, you can share. So there's not a commercial level to it, but there's a cottage industry to it from my scant understanding of it.
And then you've got like there's Oregon, where it's just not even feasible anymore to set up. There are thousands of grow-ups across that state, and the last I heard, the amount that Cannabis was selling for was a pound was within the dollar ranges, because there's so much glut of material. So there is also harm to loose regulations. A lot of businesses will go bankrupt as a result of so there needs to be restrictions around that as well. It's fascinating. I do think as a result, the Senate inquiry, there's so many data points to now look at. There's so many different instances that you could really make an informed decision around how the recreational model for Australia would unfold. And
thinking of that with all those data points, one of the kind of curious things that I've been pushing with this inquiry is that we look at the national wastewater results. So, and I think this will be the first time that a parliamentary committee has looked at wastewater results to work out where we need to target our inquiry. So you can go on.
Okay, I'm curious.
We can see, so they do this wastewater study that looks at illicit drug use across the country. So we can actually see from that data where the highest use of cannabis is. So we can then be starting to target those communities and say, hey, we want to hear from you. There's a lot of cannabis use in your community. What do you think about it? What do you think we should do? So we're looking at that, because in actual fact, according to the wastewater, and I think according to the National Household Drug Survey, there's more cannabis consumed in regional areas than in the metropolitan areas.
In the regional than the metro? Really?
Yeah. So there's higher use in the regional areas. And I remember a police officer telling me that, Fiona, whenever we do a big bust on cannabis, we see a big increase in methamphetamine use.
Okay.
So once you get rid of the cannabis, people are directed to other products.
Yeah, that's a part. I mean, they call cannabis a gateway drug, and I definitely argue on what that is, because what the question of what it actually means is it's a more philosophical discussion, because realistically you look at alcohol as a drug or pharmaceuticals as drugs, and it's the relationship that you have, and also there's many complex issues around childhood trauma that lead to drug use. So cannabis is just another drug. All drugs are drugs. Whether they're harmful or not is another question, because ultimately there's an action, a purpose, and an outcome that these drugs fulfill. And so long as everything's done in moderation, and a purpose is fulfilled safely, then do what you need to do. But I find that quite interesting that when cannabis is removed from an area that methamphetamine in particular would increase.
I know. It's bizarre, Adam. It's bizarre. And what they said is that he seemed to think because it was the same dealer that was selling the cannabis. So when the young person went to buy cannabis, there was no cannabis, but they said, look, this will give you a buzz. This will give you
Interesting.
An effect, and that was how it was moved. That was how it was moved. That is completely anecdotal. So I'm hoping that we may see that data. I'm hoping that we may find out that the greater prohibition, the greater prohibition of cannabis, when you bust cannabis, all you do is you see a knock-on effect that other drugs come in. And look, I mean, we could have a whole show, and I know we don't have time, but a whole show on synthetic cannabinoids.
Yeah.
And the cowboys that were involved in that industry. I mean, there were some good people involved in that industry, but there was cowboys who were just mixing shit up in a bucket and spraying it on something green and selling it in baggies to smoke. And
people died.
It was
it's but it also demonstrates that people will find their alternative regardless of whether it's legal or illegal.
That's right.
And it comes back to that safety profile. And this is one of my challenges that I have with. I think that the Australian infrastructure for prescribing cannabis works. It could be better. We could adopt what New Zealand's done. I really think that would be a better approach, because it's really then up to the doctor to prescribe without any blockages from the TGA. Even though they're doing a great job and the prescriptions are coming through, I do think they can leave that decision to doctors.
Yes.
But the issues around the accessibility of these products on the black market is extreme, because these products aren't tested. We don't know anything about them. There's no consistency or quality control. There are compassionate grey market growers that I have a tremendous respect for, who do care about what they give to their patients, but that's the minority, not the majority. The most compelling argument that I would imagine that can be put forward is you're endangering people by not allowing them to clearly access what they want. The data is clear, they want it. So how do we create a legal framework that supports the government and its people to access to have their civil rights, their civil rights?
Well, I think, it's in some ways it's a coming out of the closet, and we see that in the Canadian, actually I don't know if I saw it in the Canadian campaign, certainly in the New Zealand campaign and some of the campaigns in America, where you see, lawyers, a whole range of different mothers, fathers, a whole range of different people talking about their cannabis use and talking about how, here I am. I haven't turned into, a sloth. I'm not just, sitting there with Doritos dribbling down my chin. But I find that this is enjoyable and I should have the right to do this, or this is my glass of wine. As I saw a campaign in New Zealand recently for saying. So I think we need to be out there. We need to voice our support for cannabis reform. And I know it's scary, because I know that, still it's illegal to use it. So coming out, how does that affect your prospects for work? Does that affect a whole range of family life? How does that affect you? But I actually think we do need to be standing up, and when the stereotypes and perceptions of people who use cannabis are busted, that will greatly assist us in moving forward.
Yeah, but you've got, what does the stereotype of an alcoholic look like? And that's still perfectly acceptable social norm.
Yeah.
And that is by far, from all the data I've consumed and the relationships I've developed with people who consume cannabis, my own experience with the cannabis, you are far more likely to have a harder time with an alcohol addiction than with a cannabis addiction. And no joke, there is definitely a cannabis addiction. I'm not putting that aside. It's just if you compare apples to apples, the social acceptance of one versus the other, it's if you do the research, it's very clear. The data will stack up.
Yeah.
You're not dealing with I'm not advocating for now creating a system where people can access methamphetamines for free. Granted, I think prohibition is a good model for this either, but you're dealing with a relatively safe product. Now, there are always dangers in anything that you consume, but so far there hasn't been a death in history reported due to cannabis use. 88,000 a year due to alcohol abuse. It's very clear how this is. It has a good safety profile. I just want to go back to the international market that you've looked at. Can you talk about some of the things that you didn't think were applicable? What are the things that you saw that didn't work, that make sense to you, that you wouldn't encourage Australia to pursue?
I mean, it's not. It was a byproduct of the outcome, but the fact that it became a cash only industry in the United States because of some of the banking legislation. So, that to me didn't seem to be particularly good. I think the level of advertising in the States, we probably could look at curbing that. I don't think, and that's probably just from political, practical perspective that you probably want to do that and indicate that. I think the prohibition on edibles and the prohibition on those ones, I think that's I don't think that's sensible, because we actually know some of the greater risks of cannabis are actually within the inhaling of the tar into your lungs. So if you create safer products that are edibles or products that you can vape, so moving to those
without vitamin E acetate, I should add, and making sure it's completely quality controlled, because you don't want that. And that was a really great example of what happens when you allow either a market that's not fully regulated to operate or black markets to thrive. Again, people start to suffer, and there were several deaths reported due to that vitamin E acetate issue, and there was some other research propositions around different pesticides that were used, but it was really the main protagonist was, from my understanding, vitamin E acetate. So it just keeps coming back to the sense that it makes to implement this model. And really keep asking myself, will COVID impact Australia's decision making when it comes to bringing in adult use cannabis? Because if you look at the numbers, the tax incentives are pretty attractive.
Yeah, and I think certainly I talk about that quite regularly with other with MPs when we used to be allowed to speak in the corridors of Parliament. But yeah, I mean, this is, we can help with those budget black holes. Not only in the savings from the policing, but obviously in the in the licensing and the taxation and in those areas. I think the other thing that we've seen and people talk about is that first you do medicinal, you let that run for a decade, and then you do adult use. I don't buy that. I actually think that we can continue to work in our medicinal area. We can continue to do the research. We can continue to try and make those products as accessible as possible for people who need them. But I don't think that should preclude us or exclude us from working on an adult use product that is actually about is not necessarily medicinal. Although, if it helps people sleep at night, having half a cookie in the evenings gives them a better night's sleep. Well, is that medicinal or is that Or
Yeah, well, I mean that's I mean some people use wine, unfortunately, like using wine to put themselves to sleep. That's a separate discussion. I wouldn't encourage if you're relying on medications to help you sleep. There's an underlying issue there that needs to be addressed, and it's 5 to 10 milligrams of THC in the evenings. Quite from what I've heard from different doctors that have prescribed, they've mentioned that this is an effective dose.
Yeah.
It could be less, it could be more. This is all patient specific, and I wouldn't begin to comment on that with any authority. But the reality is, the safety profile is far more sufficient than the other mediums that are being used to drug people or to put them into an alcoholic state to put them to sleep. I think there's so many upsides to what this could do for Australia, and the tourism industry in itself. We've only got a few more minutes left, so I'll pause it at that. But I just think that the tourism industry itself would be significant. You look at the Netherlands, for example. I mean, did you look at any of the numbers around tourism?
I did, and I think the Netherlands is the Netherlands is the Netherlands, and they have their own special way of going about things. And I think there's some things we can learn from them, but there's probably a lot of things we can learn from them not to do. But I look at how this could assist our agricultural industry and how it could assist our farmers. And that's another conversation when I'm on a hemp task force and looking at hemp. But this plant, whether we're using it for medicinal, whether we're using it and the different strains of it, whether it's the hemp plant or the plants that have a psychoactive effect, this plant has so many positives and so many ways that we could be addressing it. We need to get rid of the stigma on it, but we could see fantastic tourism, fantastic farming, fantastic manufacturing opportunities, fantastic medical innovation opportunities. I mean, it's all it's almost endless.
Yeah, I fully agree with you, and I'm just having a quick look at if there's any questions in the comment stream, but I think we've covered quite a lot. And Fiona, I'm really appreciative that you took this time to speak with me about the work that you're doing. I'm truly supportive of the initiative, and I really hope that that you are able to proceed forward with the support from the government to build a viable industry for Australia. If there's any help I can add from providing it to the mailing list or any links that you want to share, please feel free, and I'll be able to do so after this. So again, thank you for being so generous with your time, and it was an absolute
everyone.
pleasure.
And please put a submission in. I'll send you the links for those things in a minute.
Wonderful. Fiona, take care of yourself and all the best.
Thanks very much. See you. Bye.
My pleasure.
Bye.